Chapter 26 of Anne of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anne of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 26 Around the Bend. Thomas Lynde faded out of life as quietly and unobtrusively as he had lived it. His wife was a tender, patient, unwearied nurse. Sometimes Rachel had been a little hard on her Thomas in health, when his slowness or meekness had provoked her, but when he became ill no voice could be lower, no hand more gently skilful, no vigil more uncomplaining.
"You've been a good wife to me, Rachel,"
he once said simply, when she was sitting by him in the dusk, holding his thin, blanched old hand in her work-hardened one.
"A good wife. I'm sorry I ain't leaving you better off, but the children will look after you. They're all smart, capable children, just like their mother. A good mother. A good woman."
He had fallen asleep then, and the next morning, just as the white dawn was creeping up over the pointed firs in the hollow, Marilla went softly into the east gable and wakened Anne.
"Anne, Thomas Lynde is gone. Their hired boy just brought the word. I'm going right down to Rachel."
On the day after Thomas Lynde's funeral, Marilla went about Green Gables with a strangely preoccupied air. Occasionally she looked at Anne, seemed on the point of saying something, then shook her head and buttoned up her mouth. After tea she went down to see Mrs. Rachel, and when she returned she went to the east gable, where Anne was correcting school exercises. "How is Mrs. Lynde tonight?" asked the latter.
"She's feeling calmer and more composed,"
answered Marilla, sitting down on Anne's bed, a proceeding which betokened some unusual mental excitement, for in Marilla's code of household ethics to sit on a bed after it was made up was an unpardonable offense.
"But she's very lonely. Eliza had to go home today. Her son isn't well, and she felt she couldn't stay any longer."
"When I've finished these exercises I'll run down and chat a while with Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "I had intended to study some Latin composition tonight, but it can wait."
"I suppose Gilbert Blythe is going to college in the fall?"
said Marilla jerkily.
"How would you like to go too, Anne?"
Anne looked up in astonishment. "I would like it, of course, Marilla, but it isn't possible."
"I guess it can be made possible. I've always felt that you should go. I've never felt easy to think you were giving it all up on my account."
"But, Marilla, I've never been sorry for a moment that I stayed home. I've been so happy. Oh, these past 2 years have just been delightful."
"Oh, yes, I know you've been contented enough. But that isn't the question exactly. You ought to go on with your education. You've saved enough to put you through 1 year at Redmond, and the money the stock brought in will do for another year. And there's scholarships and things you might win."
"Yes, but I can't go, Marilla. Your eyes are better, of course, but I can't leave you alone with the twins. They need so much looking after."
"I won't be alone with them. That's what I meant to discuss with you. I had a long talk with Rachel tonight, and she's feeling dreadful bad over a good many things. She's not left very well off. It seems they mortgaged the farm 8 years ago to give the youngest boy a start when he went west, and they've never been able to pay much more than the interest since. And then, of course, Thomas's illness has cost a good deal one way or another. The farm will have to be sold, and Rachel thinks there'll be hardly anything left after the bills are settled. She says she'll have to go and live with Eliza, and it's breaking her heart to think of leaving Avonlea. A woman of her age doesn't make new friends and interests easy. And Anne, as she talked about it, the thought came to me that I would ask her to come and live with me. But I thought I ought to talk it over with you first before I said anything to her. If I had Rachel living with me, you could go to college. How do you feel about it?"
"I feel as if somebody had handed me the moon, and I didn't know exactly what to do with it," said Anne dazedly. "But as for asking Mrs. Lynde to come here, that is for you to decide, Marilla. Do you are you sure you would like it? Mrs. Lynde is a good woman and a kind neighbor, but...
But she's got her faults, you mean to say? Well, she has, of course. But I think I'd rather put up with far worse faults than see Rachel go away from Avonlea. I'd miss her terrible. She's the only close friend I've got here, and I'd be lost without her. We've been neighbours for 45 years, and we've never had a quarrel. Though we came rather near it that time you flew at Mrs. Rachel for calling you homely and red-haired. Do you remember, Anne?
I should think I do, said Anne ruefully. People don't forget things like that. How I hated poor Mrs. Rachel at that moment.
And then that apology you made her. Well, you were a handful in all conscience, Anne. I did feel so puzzled and bewildered how to manage you. Matthew understood you better.
Matthew understood everything, said Anne softly, as she always spoke of him.
Well, I think it could be managed so that Rachel and I wouldn't clash at all. It always seemed to me that the reason two women can't get along in one house is that they try to share the same kitchen and get in each other's way. Now, if Rachel came here, she could have the north gable for her bedroom and the spare room for a kitchen as well as not, for we don't really need a spare room at all. She could put her stove there and what furniture she wanted to keep and be real comfortable and independent. She'll have enough to live on, of course. Her children'll see to that. So all I'd be giving her would be house room. Yes, Anne. As far as I'm concerned, I'd like it.
Then ask her, said Anne promptly. I'd be very sorry myself to see Mrs. Rachel go away.
And if she comes,
continued Marilla,
you can go to college as well as not. She'll be company for me, and she'll do for the twins what I can't do, so there's no reason in the world why you shouldn't go.
Anne had a long meditation at her window that night. Joy and regret struggled together in her heart. She had come at last, suddenly and unexpectedly, to the bend in the road, and college was around it, with 100 rainbow hopes and visions. But Anne realized as well that when she rounded that curve she must leave many sweet things behind, all the little simple duties and interests which had grown so dear to her in the last 2 years, and which she had glorified into beauty and delight by the enthusiasm she had put into them. She must give up her school, and she loved every one of her pupils, even the stupid and naughty ones. The mere thought of Paul Irving made her wonder if Redmond were such a name to conjure with after all. I've put out a lot of little roots these 2 years, Anne told the moon, and when I'm pulled up they're going to hurt a great deal. But it's best to go, I think, and, as Marilla says, there's no good reason why I shouldn't. I must get out all my ambitions and dust them. Anne sent in her resignation the next day, and Mrs. Rachel, after a heart-to-heart talk with Marilla, gratefully accepted the offer of a home at Green Gables. She elected to remain in her own house for the summer, however. The farm was not to be sold until the fall, and there were many arrangements to be made.
I certainly never thought of living as far off the road as Green Gables,
sighed Mrs. Rachel to herself.
But really, Green Gables doesn't seem as out of the world as it used to do. Anne has lots of company, and the twins make it real lively. And anyhow, I'd rather live at the bottom of a well than leave Avonlea.
These 2 decisions being noised abroad speedily ousted the arrival of Mrs. Harrison in popular gossip. Sage heads were shaken over Marilla Cuthbert's rash step in asking Mrs. Rachel to live with her. People opined that they wouldn't get on together. They were both too fond of their own way, and many doleful predictions were made, none of which disturbed the parties in question at all. They had come to a clear and distinct understanding of the respective duties and rights of their new arrangements, and meant to abide by them.
I won't meddle with you, nor you with me,
Mrs. Rachel had said decidedly.
And as for the twins, I'll be glad to do all I can for them. But I won't undertake to answer Davy's questions, that's what. I'm not an encyclopedia, neither am I a Philadelphia lawyer. You'll miss Anne for that.
Sometimes Anne's answers were about as queer as Davy's questions,
said Marilla dryly.
The twins will miss her, and no mistake. But her future can't be sacrificed to Davy's thirst for information. When he asks questions I can't answer, I'll just tell him children should be seen and not heard. That was how I was brought up, and I don't know but what it was just as good a way as all these new-fangled notions for training children.
Well, Anne's methods seem to have worked fairly well with Davy,
said Mrs. Lynde smilingly.
He is a reformed character, that's what.
He isn't a bad little soul,
conceded Marilla.
I never expected to get as fond of those children as I have. Davy gets round you somehow. And Dora is a lovely child, although she is kind of
monotonous? Exactly,
supplied Mrs. Rachel.
Like a book where every page is the same, that's what. Dora will make a good, reliable woman, but she'll never set the pond on fire. Well, that sort of folks are comfortable to have round, even if they're not as interesting as the other kind.
Gilbert Blythe was probably the only person to whom the news of Anne's resignation brought unmixed pleasure. Her pupils looked upon it as a sheer catastrophe. Annetta Bell had hysterics when she went home. Anthony Pye fought 2 pitched and unprovoked battles with other boys by way of relieving his feelings. Barbara Shaw cried all night. Paul Irving defiantly told his grandmother that she needn't expect him to eat any porridge for a week.
"I can't do it, Grandma,"
he said.
"I don't really know if I can eat anything. I feel as if there was a dreadful lump in my throat. I'd have cried coming home from school if Jake Donnell hadn't been watching me. I believe I will cry after I go to bed. It wouldn't show in my eyes tomorrow, would it? And it would be such a relief. But anyway, I can eat porridge. I'm going to need all my strength of mind to bear up against this, Grandma, and I won't have any left to grapple with porridge. Oh, Grandma, I don't know what I'll do when my beautiful teacher goes away. Milty Boulter says he bets Jane Andrews will get the school. I suppose Miss Andrews is very nice, but I know she won't understand things like Miss Shirley."
Diana also took a very pessimistic view of affairs.
"It will be horribly lonesome here next winter,"
she mourned, one twilight when the moonlight was raining airy silver through the cherry boughs, and filling the east gable with a soft, dreamlike radiance in which the 2 girls sat and talked, Anne on her low rocker by the window, Diana sitting Turk fashion on the bed.
"You and Gilbert will be gone, and the Allens too. They are going to call Mr. Allen to Charlottetown, and of course he will accept. It's too mean. We'll be vacant all winter, I suppose, and have to listen to a long string of candidates, and half of them won't be any good."
"I hope they won't call Mr. Baxter from East Grafton here anyhow," said Anne decidedly. "He wants the call, but he does preach such gloomy sermons. Mr. Bell says he's a minister of the old school, but Mrs. Lynde says there's nothing whatever the matter with him but indigestion. His wife isn't a very good cook, it seems, and Mrs. Lynde says that when a man has to eat sour bread 2 weeks out of 3, his theology is bound to get a kink in it somewhere. Mrs. Allen feels very badly about going away. She says everybody has been so kind to her since she came here as a bride that she feels as if she were leaving lifelong friends. And then there's the baby's grave, you know. She says she doesn't see how she can go away and leave that. It was such a little mite of a thing, and only 3 months old. And she says she is afraid it will miss its mother, although she knows better and wouldn't say so to Mr. Allen for anything. She says she has slipped through the birch grove back of the manse nearly every night to the graveyard and sung a little lullaby to it. She told me all about it last evening when I was up putting some of those early wild roses on Matthew's grave. I promised her that as long as I was in Avonlea I would put flowers on the baby's grave, and when I was away I felt sure that
I would do it,"
supplied Diana heartily.
"Of course I will. And I'll put them on Matthew's grave too, for your sake, Anne."
"Oh, thank you. I meant to ask you if you would. And on little Hester Gray's too. Please don't forget hers. Do you know, I've thought and dreamed so much about little Hester Gray that she has become strangely real to me. I think of her, back there in her little garden in that cool, still green corner, and I have a fancy that if I could steal back there some spring evening, just at the magic time twixt light and dark, and tiptoe so softly up the beech hill that my footsteps could not frighten her, I would find the garden just as it used to be, all sweet with June lilies and early roses, with the tiny house beyond it all hung with vines, and little Hester Gray would be there, with her soft eyes and the wind ruffling her dark hair, wandering about, putting her fingertips under the chins of the lilies, and whispering secrets with the roses, and I would go forward, oh, so softly, and hold out my hands and say to her, 'Little Hester Gray, won't you let me be your playmate, for I love the roses too?' And we would sit down on the old bench and talk a little and dream a little, or just be beautifully silent together. And then the moon would rise and I would look around me, and there would be no Hester Gray and no little vine-hung house and no roses, only an old waste garden starred with June lilies amid the grasses, and the wind sighing, oh, so sorrowfully in the cherry trees, and I would not know whether it had been real or if I had just imagined it all." Diana crawled up and got her back against the headboard of the bed. When your companion of twilight hour said such spooky things, it was just as well not to be able to fancy there was anything behind you.
I'm afraid the Improvement Society will go down when you and Gilbert are both gone,"
she remarked dolefully. "Not a bit of fear of it," said Anne briskly, coming back from dreamland to the affairs of practical life. "It is too firmly established for that, especially since the older people are becoming so enthusiastic about it. Look what they are doing this summer for their lawns and lanes. Besides, I'll be watching for hints at Redmond, and I'll write a paper for it next winter and send it over. Don't take such a gloomy view of things, Diana. And don't grudge me my little hour of gladness and jubilation now. Later on, when I have to go away, I'll feel anything but glad."
"It's all right for you to be glad. You're going to college, and you'll have a jolly time and make heaps of lovely new friends."
"I hope I shall make new friends," said Anne thoughtfully. "The possibilities of making new friends help to make life very fascinating. But no matter how many friends I make, they'll never be as dear to me as the old ones, especially a certain girl with black eyes and dimples. Can you guess who she is, Diana?"
"But there'll be so many clever girls at Redmond."
sighed Diana.
"And I'm only a stupid little country girl who says 'I seen' sometimes, though I really know better when I stop to think. Well, of course, these past 2 years have really been too pleasant to last. I know somebody who is glad you are going to Redmond anyhow. And I'm going to ask you a question, a serious question. Don't be vexed, and do answer seriously. Do you care anything for Gilbert?"
"Ever so much as a friend, and not a bit in the way you mean," said Anne calmly and decidedly. She also thought she was speaking sincerely. Diana sighed. She wished, somehow, that Anne had answered differently.
"Don't you mean ever to be married, Anne?"
"Perhaps, some day, when I meet the right one," said Anne, smiling dreamily up at the moonlight.
"But how can you be sure when you do meet the right one?"
persisted Diana. "Oh, I should know him. Something would tell me. You know what my ideal is, Diana."
"But people's ideals change sometimes."
"Mine won't, and I couldn't care for any man who didn't fulfill it."
"What if you never meet him?"
"Then I shall die an old maid," was the cheerful response. "I dare say it isn't the hardest death by any means."
"Oh, I suppose the dying would be easy enough. It's the living an old maid I shouldn't like,"
said Diana, with no intention of being humorous.
"Although I wouldn't mind being an old maid very much if I could be one like Miss Lavendar. But I never could be. When I'm 45 I'll be horribly fat. And while there might be some romance about a thin old maid, there couldn't possibly be any about a fat one. Oh, mind you, Nelson Atkins proposed to Ruby Gillis 3 weeks ago. Ruby told me all about it. She says she never had any intention of taking him, because anyone who married him will have to go in with the old folks. But Ruby says that he made such a perfectly beautiful and romantic proposal that it simply swept her off her feet. But she didn't want to do anything rash, so she asked for a week to consider. And 2 days later she was at a meeting of the sewing circle at his mother's, and there was a book called The Complete Guide to Etiquette lying on the parlour table. Ruby said she simply couldn't describe her feelings when in a section of it headed The Deportment of Courtship and Marriage, she found the very proposal Nelson had made, word for word. She went home and wrote him a perfectly scathing refusal. And she says his father and mother have taken turns watching him ever since, for fear he'll drown himself in the river. But Ruby says they needn't be afraid, for, in the Deportment of Courtship and Marriage, it told how a rejected lover should behave, and there's nothing about drowning in that. And she says Wilbur Blair is literally pining away for her, but she's perfectly helpless in the matter.
Anne made an impatient movement. "I hate to say it. It seems so disloyal. But, well, I don't like Ruby Gillis now. I liked her when we went to school in Queens together, though not so well as you and Jane, of course. But this last year at Carmody she seems so different, so...
"I know,"
nodded Diana.
"It's the Gillis coming out in her. She can't help it. Mrs. Lynde says that if ever a Gillis girl thought about anything but the boys, she never showed it in her walk and conversation. She talks about nothing but boys, and what compliments they pay her. and how crazy they all are about her at Carmody. And the strange thing is, they are, too.
Diana admitted this somewhat resentfully.
Last night, when I saw her in Mr. Blair's store, she whispered to me that she'd just made a new mash. I wouldn't ask her who it was, because I knew she was dying to be asked. Well, it's what Ruby always wanted, I suppose. You remember, even when she was little, she always said she meant to have dozens of beaux when she grew up, and have the very gayest time she could before she settled down. She's so different from Jane, isn't she? Jane is such a nice, sensible, ladylike girl.
Dear old Jane is a jewel, agreed Anne. But, she added, leaning forward to bestow a tender pat on the plump, dimpled little hand hanging over the pillow, there's nobody like my own Diana after all. Do you remember that evening we first met, Diana, and swore eternal friendship in your garden? We've kept that oath, I think. We've never had a quarrel, nor even a coolness. I shall never forget the thrill that went over me the day you told me you loved me. I had had such a lonely, starved heart all through my childhood. I'm just beginning to realize how starved and lonely it really was. Nobody cared anything for me or wanted to be bothered with me. I should have been miserable if it hadn't been for that strange little dream life of mine, wherein I imagined all the friends and love I craved. But when I came to Green Gables everything was changed. And then I met you. You don't know what your friendship meant to me. I want to thank you here and now, dear, for the warm and true affection you've always given me.
And always, always will,
sobbed Diana.
I shall never love anybody, any girl, half as well as I love you. And if I ever do marry and have a little girl of my own, I'm going to name her Anne.
End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Anne of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anne of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 27. An Afternoon at the Stone House.
"Where are you going all dressed up, Anne?"
Davy wanted to know.
"You look bully in that dress."
Anne had come down to dinner in a new dress of pale green muslin, the first color she had worn since Matthew's death. It became her perfectly, bringing out all the delicate flower-like tints of her face and the gloss and burnish of her hair. "Davy, how many times have I told you that you mustn't use that word?" she rebuked. "I'm going to Echo Lodge."
"Take me with you,"
entreated Davy. "I would if I were driving, but I'm going to walk, and it's too far for your 8-year-old legs. Besides, Paul is going with me, and I fear you don't enjoy yourself in his company."
"Oh, I like Paul lots better'n I did,"
said Davy, beginning to make fearful inroads into his pudding.
"Since I've got pretty good myself, I don't mind his being gooder so much. If I can keep on, I'll catch up with him some day, both in legs and goodness. 'Sides, Paul's real nice to us second primer boys in school. He won't let the other big boys meddle with us, and he shows us lots of games."
"How came Paul to fall into the brook at noon hour yesterday?" asked Anne. "I met him on the playground, such a dripping figure that I sent him promptly home for clothes without waiting to find out what had happened."
"Well, it was partly a zaccident,"
explained Davy.
"He stuck his head in on purpose, but the rest of him fell in zaccidentally. We was all down at the brook, and Prillie Rogerson got mad at Paul about something. She's awful mean and horrid anyway, if she is pretty. And said that his grandmother put his hair up in curl rags every night. Paul wouldn't have minded what she said, I guess, but Gracie Andrews laughed, and Paul got awful red, 'cause Gracie's his girl, you know. He's clean gone on her. Brings her flowers and carries her books as far as the shore road. He got as red as a beet, and said his grandmother didn't do any such thing, and his hair was born curly. And then he laid down on the bank and stuck his head right into the spring to show them. Oh, it wasn't the spring we drunk out of,"
seeing a horrified look on Marilla's face.
"It was the little one lower down. But the bank's awful slippy, and Paul went right in. I tell you he made a bully splash. Oh, Anne, I didn't mean to say that. It just slipped out before I thought. He made a splendid splash. But he looked so funny when he crawled out, all wet and muddy. The girls laughed more'n ever, but Gracie didn't laugh. She looked sorry. Gracie's a nice girl, but she's got a snub nose. When I get big enough to have a girl, I won't have one with a snub nose. I'll pick one with a pretty nose like yours, Anne.
A boy who makes such a mess of syrup all over his face when he is eating his pudding will never get a girl to look at him,
said Marilla severely.
But I'll wash my face before I go courting,
protested Davy, trying to improve matters by rubbing the back of his hand over the smears.
And I'll wash behind my ears, too, without being told. I remembered to this morning, Marilla. I don't forget half as often as I did, but—
and Davy sighed.
There's so many corners about a fellow that it's awful hard to remember them all. Well, if I can't go to Miss Lavendar's, I'll go over and see Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Harrison's an awful nice woman, I tell you. She keeps a jar of cookies in her pantry a-purpose for little boys, and she always gives me the scrapings out of a pan she's mixed up a plum cake in. A good many plums stick to the sides, you see. Mr. Harrison was always a nice man, but he's twice as nice since he got married over again. I guess getting married makes folks nicer. Why don't you get married, Marilla? I want to know.
Marilla's state of single blessedness had never been a sore point with her, so she answered amiably, with an exchange of significant looks with Anne, that she supposed it was because nobody would have her.
But maybe you never asked anybody to have you,
protested Davy.
Oh, Davy,
said Dora primly, shocked into speaking without being spoken to.
It's the men that have to do the asking.
I don't know why they have to do it always,
grumbled Davy.
Seems to me everything's put on the men in this world. Can I have some more pudding, Marilla?
You've had as much as was good for you,
said Marilla, but she gave him a moderate second helping.
I wish people could live on pudding. Why can't they, Marilla? I want to know.
Because they'd soon get tired of it.
I'd like to try that for myself,
said skeptical Davy.
But I guess it's better to have pudding only on Fish and Company days than none at all. They never have any at Milty Boulter's. Milty says when company comes, his mother gives them cheese and cuts it herself, one little bit apiece, and one over for manners.
If Milty Boulter talks like that about his mother, at least you needn't repeat it,
said Marilla severely.
Bless my soul!
Davy had picked this expression up from Mr. Harrison and used it with great gusto.
Milty meant it as a compliment. He's awful proud of his mother, 'cause folks say she could scratch a living on a rock.
I suppose them pesky hens are in my pansy bed again,
said Marilla, rising and going out hurriedly. The slandered hens were nowhere near the pansy bed, and Marilla did not even glance at it. Instead, she sat down on the cellar hatch and laughed until she was ashamed of herself. When Anne and Paul reached the stone house that afternoon, they found Miss Lavendar and Charlotta the Fourth in the garden, weeding, raking, clipping, and trimming as if for dear life. Miss Lavendar herself, all gay and sweet in the frills and laces she loved, dropped her shears and ran joyously to meet her guests, while Charlotta the Fourth grinned cheerfully.
"Welcome, Anne. I thought you'd come today. You belong to the afternoon, so it brought you. Things that belong together are sure to come together. What a lot of trouble that would save some people if they only knew it, but they don't. And so they waste beautiful energy moving heaven and earth to bring things together that don't belong. And you, Paul? Why, you've grown. You're half a head taller than when you were here before."
Yes, I have begun to grow like pigweed in the night, as Mrs. Lynde says,
said Paul, in frank delight over the fact.
Grandma says it's the porridge taking effect at last. Perhaps it is. Goodness knows.
Paul sighed deeply.
I've eaten enough to make anyone grow. I do hope, now that I've begun, I'll keep on till I'm as tall as father. He is 6 feet, you know, Miss Lavendar.
Yes, Miss Lavendar did know. The flush on her pretty cheeks deepened a little. She took Paul's hand on one side and Anne's on the other and walked to the house in silence.
Is it a good day for the echoes, Miss Lavendar?
queried Paul anxiously. The day of his first visit had been too windy for echoes, and Paul had been much disappointed.
Yes, just the best kind of day,
answered Miss Lavendar, rousing herself from her reverie.
But first, we are all going to have something to eat. I know you two folks didn't walk all the way back here through those beech woods without getting hungry. And Charlotta the Fourth and I can eat any hour of the day. We have such obliging appetites. So we'll just make a raid on the pantry. Fortunately, it's lovely and full. I had the presentiment that I was going to have company today, and Charlotta the Fourth and I prepared,
I think you are one of the people who always have nice things in their pantry,
declared Paul.
Grandma's like that too, but she doesn't approve of snacks between meals. I wonder,
he added meditatively,
if I ought to eat them away from home when I know she doesn't approve.
Oh, I don't think she would disapprove after you have had such a long walk. That makes a difference,
said Miss Lavendar, exchanging amused glances with Anne over Paul's brown curls.
I suppose that snacks are extremely unwholesome. That is why we have them so often at Echo Lodge. We, Charlotta the Fourth and I, live in defiance of every known law of diet. We eat all sorts of indigestible things whenever we happen to think of it, by day or night. And we flourish like green bay trees. We are always intending to reform. When we read any article in a paper warning us against something we like, we cut it out and pin it up on the kitchen wall so that we'll remember it. But we never can, somehow, until after we've gone and eaten that very thing. Nothing has killed us yet. But Charlotta the Fourth has been known to have bad dreams after we have eaten donuts and mince pie and fruitcake before we went to bed.
Grandma lets me have a glass of milk and a slice of bread and butter before I go to bed, and on Sunday nights she puts jam on the bread,
said Paul.
So I'm always glad when it's Sunday night, for more reasons than one. Sunday is a very long day on the shore road. Grandma says it's all too short for her, and that Father never found Sundays tiresome when he was a little boy. It wouldn't seem so long if I could talk to my rock people, but I never do that because Grandma doesn't approve of it on Sundays. I think a good deal, but I'm afraid my thoughts are worldly. Grandma says we should never think anything but religious thoughts on Sundays. But teacher here said once that every really beautiful thought was religious, no matter what it was about or what day we thought it on. But I feel sure Grandma thinks that sermons and Sunday school lessons are the only things you can think truly religious thoughts about. And when it comes to a difference of opinion between Grandma and teacher, I don't know what to do. In my heart,
Paul laid his hand on his breast and raised very serious blue eyes to Miss Lavendar's immediately sympathetic face.
I agree with teacher, but then you see, Grandma has brought Father up her way and made a brilliant success of him. And teacher has never brought anybody up yet, though she's helping with Davy and Dora. But you can't tell how they'll turn out till they are grown up. So sometimes I feel as if it might be safer to go by Grandma's opinions.
I think it would, agreed Anne solemnly. Anyway, I dare say that if your grandma and I both got down to what we really do mean, under our different ways of expressing it, we'd find out we both meant much the same thing. You'd better go by her way of expressing it, since it's been the result of experience. We'll have to wait until we see how the twins do turn out before we can be sure that my way is equally good. After lunch they went back to the garden, where Paul made the acquaintance of the echoes, to his wonder and delight, while Anne and Miss Lavendar sat on the stone bench under the poplar and talked.
So you are going away in the fall,
said Miss Lavendar wistfully.
I ought to be glad for your sake, Anne, but I'm horribly selfishly sorry. I shall miss you so much. Oh, sometimes I think it is of no use to make friends. They only go out of your life after a while and leave a hurt that is worse than the emptiness before they came.
That sounds like something Miss Eliza Andrews might say, but never Miss Lavendar, said Anne. Nothing is worse than emptiness, and I'm not going out of your life. There are such things as letters and vacations. Dearest, I'm afraid you're looking a little pale and tired.
Oh.
Went Paul on the dyke, where he had been making noises diligently, not all of them melodious in the making, but all coming back transmuted into the very gold and silver of sound by the fairy alchemists over the river. Miss Lavendar made an impatient movement with her pretty hands.
I'm just tired of everything, even the echoes. There is nothing in life but echoes. Echoes of lost hopes and dreams and joys. They're beautiful and mocking. Oh, Anne, it's horrid of me to talk like this when I have company. It's just that I'm getting old, and it doesn't agree with me. I know I'll be fearfully cranky by the time I'm 60. But perhaps all I need is a course of blue pills.
At this moment Charlotta the Fourth, who had disappeared after lunch, returned and announced that the northeast corner of Mr. John Kimball's pasture was red with early strawberries, and wouldn't Miss Shirley like to go and pick some?
Early strawberries for tea!
Exclaimed Miss Lavendar.
Oh, I'm not so old as I thought, and I don't need a single blue pill. Girls, when you come back with your strawberries, we'll have tea out here under the silver poplar. I'll have it all ready for you with home-grown cream.
Anne and Charlotta the Fourth accordingly betook themselves back to Mr. Kimball's pasture, a green remote place where the air was as soft as velvet and fragrant as a bed of violets and golden as amber. "Oh, isn't it sweet and fresh back here?" breathed Anne. "I just feel as if I were drinking in the sunshine."
"Yes, ma'am, so do I. That's just exactly how I feel too, ma'am,"
agreed Charlotta the Fourth, who would have said precisely the same thing if Anne had remarked that she felt like a pelican of the wilderness. Always after Anne had visited Echo Lodge, Charlotta the Fourth mounted to her little room over the kitchen, and tried before her looking-glass to speak and look and move like Anne. Charlotta could never flatter herself that she quite succeeded, but practice makes perfect, as Charlotta had learned at school, and she fondly hoped that in time she might catch the trick of that dainty uplift of chin, that quick, starry outflashing of eyes, that fashion of walking as if you were a bough swaying in the wind. It seemed so easy when you watched Anne. Charlotta the Fourth admired Anne wholeheartedly. It was not that she thought her so very handsome. Diana Barry's beauty of crimson cheek and black curls was much more to Charlotta the Fourth's taste than Anne's moonshine charm of luminous grey eyes and the pale, ever-changing roses of her cheeks. "But I'd rather look like you than be pretty," she told Anne sincerely. Anne laughed, sipped the honey from the tribute, and cast away the sting. She was used to taking her compliments mixed. Public opinion never agreed on Anne's looks. People who had heard her called handsome met her and were disappointed. People who had heard her called plain saw her and wondered where other people's eyes were. Anne herself would never believe that she had any claim to beauty. When she looked in the glass, all she saw was a little pale face with 7 freckles on the nose thereof. Her mirror never revealed to her the elusive, ever-varying play of feeling that came and went over her features like a rosy, illuminating flame, or the charm of dream and laughter alternating in her big eyes. While Anne was not beautiful in any strictly defined sense of the word, she possessed a certain evasive charm and distinction of appearance that left beholders with a pleasurable sense of satisfaction in that softly rounded girlhood of hers, with all its strongly felt potentialities. Those who knew Anne best felt, without realizing that they felt it, that her greatest attraction was the aura of possibility surrounding her, the power of future development that was in her. She seemed to walk in an atmosphere of things about to happen. As they picked, Charlotta the Fourth confided to Anne her fears regarding Miss Lavendar. The warm-hearted little handmaiden was honestly worried over her adored mistress's condition.
"Miss Lavendar isn't well, Miss Shirley, ma'am. I'm sure she isn't, though she never complains. She hasn't seemed like herself this long while, ma'am. Not since that day you and Paul were here together before. I felt sure she called cold that night, ma'am. After you and him had gone, she went out and walked in the garden for long after dark with nothing but a little shawl on her. There was a lot of snow on the walks, and I feel sure she got a chill, ma'am. Ever since then I've noticed her acting tired and lonesome-like. She don't seem to take an interest in anything, ma'am. She never pretends company's coming, nor fixes up for it, nor nothing, ma'am. It's only when you come she seems to chirk up a bit. And the worst sign of all, Miss Shirley, ma'am."
Charlotta the Fourth lowered her voice as if she were about to tell some exceedingly weird and awful symptom indeed.
"Is that she never gets cross now when I breaks things. Why, Miss Shirley, ma'am, yesterday I broke a green and yellow bowl that's always stood on the bookcase. Her grandmother brought it out from England, and Miss Lavendar was awful choice of it. I was dusting it just as careful, Miss Shirley, ma'am, and it slipped out so fashion a fire could grab hold of it, and broke into about 40 million pieces. I tell you I was sorry and scared. I thought Miss Lavendar would scold me awful, ma'am. I'd rather she had than take it the way she did. She just come and hardly looked at it and said, "It's no matter, Charlotta. Take up the pieces and throw them away." Just like that, Miss Shirley, ma'am. Take up the pieces and throw them away, as if it wasn't her grandmother's bowl from England. Oh, she isn't well, and I feel awful bad about it. She's got nobody to look after her but me.
Charlotta the Fourth's eyes brimmed up with tears. Anne patted the little brown paw holding the cracked pink cup sympathetically. "I think Miss Lavendar needs a change, Charlotta. She stays here alone too much. Can't we induce her to go away for a little trip?" Charlotta shook her head, with its rampant bows, disconsolately.
"I don't think so, Miss Shirley, ma'am. Miss Lavendar hates visiting. She's only got 3 relations she ever visits, and she says she just goes to see them as a family duty. Last time when she come home, she says she wasn't going to visit for family duty no more. 'I've come home in love with loneliness, Charlotta,' she says to me, 'and I never want to stray from my own vine and fig tree again. My relations try so hard to make an old lady of me, and it has a bad effect on me. Just like that, Miss Shirley, ma'am. It has a very bad effect on me. So I don't think it would do any good to coax her to go visiting.'"
"We must see what can be done," said Anne decidedly, as she put the last possible berry in her pink cup. "Just as soon as I have my vacation I'll come through and spend a whole week with you. We'll have a picnic every day and pretend all sorts of interesting things, and see if we can't cheer Miss Lavendar up."
"That will be the very thing, Miss Shirley, ma'am,"
exclaimed Charlotta the Fourth in rapture. She was glad for Miss Lavendar's sake, and for her own too. With a whole week in which to study Anne constantly, she would surely be able to learn how to move and behave like her. When the girls got back to Echo Lodge, they found that Miss Lavendar and Paul had carried the little square table out of the kitchen to the garden, and had everything ready for tea. Nothing ever tasted so delicious as those strawberries and cream, eaten under a great blue sky all curdled over with fluffy little white clouds, and in the long shadows of the wood with its lispings and its murmurings. After tea, Anne helped Charlotta wash the dishes in the kitchen, while Miss Lavendar sat on the stone bench with Paul and heard all about his rock people. She was a good listener, this sweet Miss Lavendar, but just at the last it struck Paul that she had suddenly lost interest in the twin sailors.
"Miss Lavendar, why do you look at me like that?"
he asked gravely.
How do I look, Paul?
"Just as if you were looking through me at somebody I put you in mind of,"
said Paul, who had such occasional flashes of uncanny insight that it wasn't quite safe to have secrets when he was about.
You do put me in mind of somebody I knew long ago,"
said Miss Lavendar dreamily.
"When you were young?"
"Yes, when I was young. Do I seem very old to you, Paul?"
"Do you know, I can't make up my mind about that.
said Paul confidentially.
Your hair looks old. I never knew a young person with white hair. But your eyes are as young as my beautiful teacher's when you laugh. I tell you what, Miss Lavendar."
Paul's voice and face were as solemn as a judge's.
"I think you would make a splendid mother. You have just the right look in your eyes, the look my little mother always had. I think it's a pity you haven't any boys of your own."
"I have a little dream boy, Paul."
"Oh, have you really? How old is he?"
"About your age, I think. He ought to be older because I dreamed him long before you were born, but I'll never let him get any older than 11 or 12. Because if I did, some day he might grow up altogether, and then I'd lose him."
"I know."
nodded Paul.
"That's the beauty of dream people. They stay any age you want them. You and my beautiful teacher, and me myself, are the only folks in the world that I know of that have dream people. Isn't it funny and nice we should all know each other? But I guess that kind of people always find each other out. Grandma never has dream people, and Mary Joe thinks I'm in the wrong upper story because I have them. But I think it's splendid to have them. You know, Miss Lavendar. Tell me all about your little dream boy."
He has blue eyes and curly hair. He steals in and awakens me with a kiss every morning. Then all day he plays here in the garden. And I play with him. Such games as we have. We run races and talk with the echoes. And I tell him stories. And when the twilight comes...
"I know,"
interrupted Paul eagerly.
"he comes and sits beside you. So! Because of course At 12 he'd be too big to climb into your lap. And lays his head on your shoulder. So. And you put your arms about him, and hold him tight, tight, and rest your cheek on his head. Yes, that's the very way. Oh, you do know, Miss Lavendar."
Anne found the two of them there when she came out of the stone house, and something in Miss Lavendar's face made her hate to disturb them. "I'm afraid we must go, Paul, if we want to get home before dark. Miss Lavendar, I'm going to invite myself to Echo Lodge for a whole week pretty soon,"
If you come for a week, I'll keep you for 2.
threatened Miss Lavendar. End of chapter 27.